I am going to start drawing the planes of this triangular prism. I'm observing the reference photo and I am noticing the angles that I'm seeing there. And just lay down your lines and don't worry so much about getting the angle exactly right. I'm focusing on the top plane of that triangular prism, trying to replicate the angles for that top plane that I see there. And I'm going to flatten out any curves that I see. When I am creating my triangular prism, I am kind of taking away curves. I know that back here, cakes and pies are going to have a curve. I am ignoring that curve and I am flattening it out or straightening it out. Because if I cannot create a sound triangular prism that shows believable form and perspective, at the end of the day, my pie is not going to be very believable. I can tell that this angle is slightly off. I need to bring down this diagonal a little bit more and just erase this. Get the perspective right. And if I, in my mind's eye, visualize this curve over here, I think it's going to be pretty close to what I'm seeing. Once I have that top plane in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to replicate the verticals or would-be verticals in a triangular prism. And notice once again how I've made this straight and vertical, even though the angle there in the photo for the pie is a diagonal at the back. And it makes sense because, you put the pie in the oven in aluminum things, the edges of it are not vertical, they have a slant to them. So I know that it's a diagonal, I can see that. I'm still simplifying everything as a flat plane because our brains understand flat horizontals and flat verticals or straight horizontals and straight verticals much more easily than diagonals and irregular lines. I'm going to be able to draw the triangular prism in the perspective that I need more easily before moving on to actually turning this into a pie. Try to give this the thickness that you need when you see that triangular prism in the reference photo, and then bring it back with a line that is parallel to this. This line should be parallel to this in a simple triangular prism. Sometimes pies are going to have a slope. We're simplifying everything for ourselves so that we can get the 3D form and perspective right. If later on what we're seeing is actually a slope and we need to bring this line down to turn it into a slope, we'll take care of that later. In the photo, I'm able to see two planes of this structure. I'm able to see the top plane and I'm able to see the side plane. I have my two planes looking good, which you can see each individual plane as a shape created by that plane. And the shape is ultimately what you're trying to recreate. Once your 3D form is looking good, this is the point where we start turning this into a pie. I'm going to turn this into a diagonal because that back of that pie is a diagonal created by the pie plate. I'm going to turn this into a curve at the back, and I can use my kneaded eraser or my soft graphite eraser to erase those lines out, which hopefully are easy to erase because you're drawing lightly. All throughout this process, I have ignored the pie crust piece that is coming up and out. I didn't really need to work on that until now. In the beginning, I'm ignoring everything that I don't need. So I was just focusing on the mass of the pie, the most important mass of it, if that makes sense. Now that this is looking right, the general, the large, now I can go ahead and add the crust that is coming up, and I'm going to recreate the curve that I already created down here in the back. Kind of like a concentric or parallel curve here at the back. Once I have that in, I have to make it look like it has thickness or volume to it. Because if I just leave it like this, it's a flat shape at the back there. It looks like a flat sheet of paper that is stuck to this voluminous structure. It doesn't have thickness to it or volume. So how do I give it volume? How do I give it thickness? All I have to do is add a second line back here. I'm going to erase this little one there. add a little edge to that so that I can give it that crust at the bottom and at the back. Really all I did was create a second line right here and a second line down here, and I connected these. Now it looks like it has thickness to it. All I did was give it depth. This plane right here is the side plane of the crust. That is pretty much it. Now, if you want to give it an extra little something and give this a little look of thickness at the top, you can add an extra top plane to the crust here and give it that extra thickness, which may or may not be visible from this perspective. But see how now it looks more and more 3D because I'm adding planes. You know how sometimes pies kind of sinks in the center when you're baking them? If you want to give it a little bit of a slight curve here, it's just a matter of curving this in a tiny bit. Use this line that you've created for your triangular prism. So all I did was visualize a little bit of a negative space or an empty space in between this line that I already created for myself and the line that I actually want for my pie. And same thing over here. All I'm going to do is use this line that I've already created, and I can just go like this and give it a little bit of a curve. And you can always bring it down more here at the front. If this seems too thick for you in the center, it's just a matter of bringing it down. You don't want to spend too long on plates, but I understand that plates can be tricky to get right. Make sure that you get symmetry right. Observe how open the ellipse is that you're seeing. And in this case, the reference photo, we cannot really see the entire ellipse. You can always do exercises, use plates you have at home and try to sketch them from direct observation or take your own photos. Look for photos that do show the entire plate or dish that you want to draw. But what I would recommend is notice how open the ellipse is, because sometimes we make them way too wide or open and then it throws off the perspective. Right now we just will have one single object. The more objects you add into your drawing, the more you have to make sure that the perspective in all of those objects is the same, because you're viewing all of those objects from the same vantage point. If you're telling me that these 2, 3, 5 objects are on that same table and we're viewing those same objects from the same vantage point. They all have to be seen at the same perspective. If one object has one perspective and the other object has another perspective, at the end, it's not going to look consistent and it's not going to look believable. You have to make sure that however you draw the ellipse for this plate makes sense with the perspective that you've already drawn and achieved in the pie. This photo is definitely not an appropriate reference photo to practice your plates because you're not able to see it completely. But I would highly recommend, if you want to practice your plates, get a great reference photo of a full plate or practice drawing your plates from direct observation that you have at home. Make sure that the ellipse that you're drawing for your plate, meaning the oval, is sound. Notice how open it is. Really try to notice what is the relationship between the height of the oval or the ellipse versus the width of it, because that is going to help you get the perspective right. And another little key thing when you're adding plates, try to see all of this space inside of the plate around the object as negative space or a negative shape, because sometimes when we're drawing freehand especially and we're trying to recreate proportions and shapes, those negative spaces or negative shapes are just as important to observe and get right than the positive active areas. If you see all of that like a negative shape, it's helpful because you can now see how much distance is between the edge of the pie and the edge of the plate here. How much distance is between the edge of the pie or the back of the pie and the back edge of the plate. How much distance is between here and here. Another triangular prism, very different perspective. Are we able to see one plane of this triangular prism, which, by the way, plane is just a fancy word for side? How many sides of this triangular prism are we able to see? Just like with the previous one, we're able to see two sides of this triangular prism, the top and the side or the front. however you'd like to see it. We're going to try to get in those shapes for our planes, and then we'll go from there. Flatten out the slopes. Okay, so I'm going to try to get in the top plane first, diagonal here at the bottom. Just start laying down those lines. Don't be afraid, because it's all a process of observing and correcting, and we refine as we go. I think I should open this up a little bit more. So I'm just gonna keep working on this, opening this up more at the back. Maybe your triangle looks too long or too short and you need to make it longer or shorten it. Getting proportions right is about getting the relationship between the different parts making up the whole right. So in order to get proportions right, we need to get the relationships between the shapes, in this case for the planes, right, to get the proportions of the pie right. I'm going to go down here. This is the top plane. I think it's looking okay. Slight diagonal at the back. Yes, I'm going to be rounding this out in a little bit. For now, I'm just leaving it as a straight line. Coming forward, dropping the vertical here, dropping a vertical here, closing with a parallel line to this. I think that I can get away with giving this a little bit more height. So I just bring this down a little bit, bring down my verticals. My triangular prism looks okay. Now I can start turning this into a curve at the back. I can also turn this into a diagonal, because this is actually a diagonal in the back, the pie plate. So I remove that vertical that I had created before. I'm going to bring up the crust. So I haven't added the crust yet. I'm going to actually create a shape for the crust. See this part over here as the top planes of the crust, because it's so thick, not so much the front of it as we did over here. Over here in this perspective, we mostly saw the front of the crust. So it's very helpful to create a little bit of an extra shape over here where you're going to be able to turn this into the top planes of the crust and create that irregularity throughout it in just a bit. It's so important to just understand what you're looking at. What part of the crust am I observing? Is this the front? Is it the top? Is it the back? Because we're observing a three-dimensional structure. And depending on where you're seeing it from and the perspective, you're going to see different parts of that three-dimensional structure, and planes are going to become distorted at times. So that's the top plane. In a bit, I'll be adding that irregularity. I'm just going to add a little bit of thickness, extra thickness back here for that little piece of crust that I'm able to see. I'm able to see a teeny tiny bit of the crust here at the bottom, but it's very thin. I can barely see it. Of course, you can always bring in your artistic license and make it thicker or more visible. I can sink this in a bit, make this slightly curved, and bring this down using that line that I already created for myself, and bring it down, erase that first line. Here, I can also bring this down. So where do I see that slight curve? And then it sinks over here at the front as well. Things are looking a little bit wonky here, so I'm just going to continue working on this part for a little bit longer. I'm going to bring this down, just observing the photo and making any changes that I might need to make in my drawing. Always using the lines that I've already placed there as guides. And I'm going to start adding irregularity to this back crust. A little bit of irregularity throughout that crust. Food items are interesting because even though we frequently use things like cookie cutters or little pie plates or things where we pour the mix and then we put it in the oven and they end up with specific shapes, what happens with food items is that there is still a lot of irregularity and imperfection throughout them, because when they are baking or cooking or whatever, throughout that process, things become imperfect. So yes, they end up with a certain specific shape in terms of color, in terms of texture, and in terms of little slight irregularities. No two pie pieces, no two cookies, no two whatever the case may be, pieces of bread are going to end up exactly the same. In that sense, food items are in between organic and man-made objects. Because when it comes to man-made objects, and I'm just continuing to make refinements here, I'm observing my sketch, I'm comparing it to the reference, and I'm just making little changes until I'm happy with how everything is looking. Food items are in between man-made and organic objects. Man-made objects have a lot more symmetry, a lot more perfection to them, a lot more flat planes to them, like boxes, etc. And organic objects are irregular, asymmetrical. They have a lot of imperfections throughout them. And when it comes to food items, there's somewhere in between. All right, so I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. And if you wanted to add the little cream puff, that is a completely organic shape. And what I do when it comes to something like that is I just create that little envelope. I don't go in and try to create a perfect curve or shape. I go in with a combination of straight lines to try to get in that general shape right. I am focusing mostly on getting the right size and the right location of that cream on that pie. Once that envelope is looking okay, then I would go ahead and add in any extra little shapes or lines within it, which the cream is a white element. Most of that 3D development would be developed via shading, lights and midtones and darks, and that's what would give this that three-dimensional form and structure. That's all I'm going to do because we're just focusing on creating lots of preliminary sketches. So moving on to this one, what do we see here? Also a triangular prism. We see the top plane and the side plane. We have a lot more stuff on this pie. The more irregularity there is in the pie, the harder it is to visualize it as flat planes. Try to do your best with this one because the next ones are going to be harder. I am just focusing on getting that top plane right. Back angle, then I'm going to drop down the side line or the edge over here. And then I'm going to connect this like so. An isosceles triangle. That's kind of the triangle that I see there. Flattened out the back and created that top plane. Are my angles looking okay? Take a moment before moving on to the next part of the process. Compare your angles, compare your lines. Do you need to change anything before moving forward? Don't rush the preliminary sketch. Remember how important it is to get this right. Is the width of the back part comparable to what you're seeing? Do you need to change that triangle in any way? I'm going to bring down the verticals, flatten the back, flatten the front. I know that this front is a little bit curved, but I'm still flattening it out. And then I'm going to make a parallel down here. The thickness is looking okay to me, especially if I add the crust as an extra below this. I'm going to give it a little bit more height, so I'm going to leave it at that. Parallel, 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 parallel. I'm going to curve this out. It's hard to see back here. It's a little bit of a mess over here. That's going to happen a lot with food items. Don't let that overwhelm you. Just keep simplifying what you're seeing. Something that can be helpful in this case is seeing the back edge of the crust. I know it's hard to see because it's a very light value and it's against a white plate, so that can be hard to see, but that back edge of the crust is a diagonal back here. So if you can't see something well, what can you see that can help you move forward with the process? There's always something that you can kind of hold on to or find that is going to help you move forward. Every single drawing that you work on is a visual puzzle that you need to solve. Sometimes things are going to be difficult to see and you're going to have to make up for the information that you're lacking visually, but always come back to your understanding of form and perspective, and that is going to serve you. That is going to enable you to draw pretty much anything that you want. I'm just going to turn this into a slight diagonal as well, using this as guide. And then I'm just going to add the extra little crust at the bottom. I'm going to turn this into a curve using the curve that I already created right here. The first curve that I used is the same curve that I'm recreating over here initially. And I'm going to add a regularity to it in just a bit. But first, I'm just creating a concentric curve. If you've never heard that word before, when I say concentric circles or concentric shapes, it just means a shape inside of another shape inside of another shape. Think of like a target. These are concentric circles. So when I say concentric curves, I just mean this curve is the same as this curve. This curve is inside of this curve. It kind of fits inside of this curve. Erase that flat line. What diagonal am I seeing back here? And then here, it looks a little bit funny. There's something missing in my crust shape. What I'm missing, and by the way, when it comes to this specific pie piece, what I'm able to see of this back crust is more so the front of it. So it's more similar to this perspective than this perspective, in the sense that we see more of the front of the crust than the top of the crust. Maybe we see a little bit of the top, but mostly we're seeing the front. What I need here is I need to create that side plane of the crust to give it a 3D form. Without this, it was just a flat shape. So I turned it into a form by giving it this depth and thickness here. And then once I have this, I can separate out what is the top plane and what is the front plane of the crust. Now it actually looks like more of a 3D form. I gave it a plane here, I gave it a plane here, and it has a front plane. So now I can see the side plane, I see the top plane, and I see the front plane. And it's not going to stay like that, but I wanted to draw out the lines so that I can better explain myself in terms of what I'm seeing. This is the top plane of the crust, of the thickness of the pastry. This is the front. This is the side. And it connects with the bottom crust. Okay, so I'm going to continue making little refinements here. I'm going to add that irregularity, always guiding myself with the lines that I've already created. Add in those imperfections that you see. Add in the extra crust lines or layers that you see. Here at the front, it's a little bit of the filling comes out a little bit here at the front. So I just added a little bit of a curve there. And I'm just making sure that the lines that I create at this point have more imperfection, irregularity to them. So you can go in with more looseness, make things a little bit more expressive if you'd like at this point. Because now that we know that perspective and form are sound, now we can use our artistic license a little bit more. If you wanted to enhance things or make things a little bit thicker or add in the little holes at this point back here. We're not adding too much detail today. That is not really the point of these exercises, but you get my point, right? So we have the base in and the structure is looking right. At this point, it's all about adding that imperfection. So here at the top, let me erase this. I think I don't need that line anymore. I need to create a bit of irregularity over here. So little bumps at the back, and then have kind of a line here. I don't want to draw a perfect line because that's not going to look very natural. I'd rather tackle those as shapes than lines. I'm going to add some thickness. So the back of this, the would-be top plane would be over these little bumps here at the back. So these little shapes that I'm adding right now are an indication of the top plane. Okay, and then there's lots of irregularity here on the actual top of the pie. So I'm actually going to change to my softer pencil grade. This is my 2B pencil. And I'm just going to go over some of these lines. Now that I know that everything is looking good, the main stuff, I can go in with more confidence and darken certain lines, add more contrast to my drawing. This is not something that I would do. If I were creating this sketch for watercoloring, I wouldn't go in with a 2B pencil. The HB pencil is already enough because I don't like seeing my pencil work through my watercolor paint. So I would make sure to leave my drawing nice and light. When it comes to sketching exercises, I like bringing in 2 pencils. Now you can see darker lines because I'm using a softer pencil grade. I don't want to get too carried away with the detail because I want to do more. What do we see here? We see another triangular prism, but this is a very different perspective. When we see something like this, it's also a triangular prism, but with the past ones, we've been able to see two planes, the top plane, the side plane, top plane, side plane, top plane, side plane. In this one, we're able to see three planes or three sides of that triangular prism. We see the top and we see the two sides. When it comes to something like this, where I would start, the front vertical is where I would start. And this is a very tall pie as well. That's the front line, the front vertical, in between the left and right sides or planes. You could start with the top plane the same way that we did with all those past ones. However, with this one, the two side planes are larger shapes than the top plane. Whereas with the other ones, the top plane was a larger shape than the side planes. I wouldn't necessarily start at the top, though you could. I mean, there are no rules here. You could start with the top. I would say that it is very important with something like this to get the side planes because they're more prominent. So what would I do in this case? I would create my three verticals, and you can see that this is actually a diagonal, but I'm still flattening things out and turning them into perfect verticals or horizontals before creating that tapered look. The thing with this pie, this perspective as well, is that there's almost a perfect symmetry in that structure because the photo was taken almost exactly at the center. When it comes to something symmetrical like this, creating these lines and making sure that this space is almost the same as this space is going to help you move forward with greater symmetry, which is what you need for this one. This is why it's also very helpful to start with the two front planes as opposed to the top plane with this specific one. The more you draw different perspectives and different things, the easier it will be for you to know where to start and how to solve that visual puzzle. That's going to get me that symmetry. And then once I have this in, I can create the angles. So what's the angle that I see? I see that angle there, and then I see another angle over here. With symmetry, something that helps me a lot as well is using horizontal lines. You can even grab yourself a ruler if you find that helpful. If you're still not able to create relatively straight horizontal lines, you can use a ruler to make sure that this diagonal starts at a similar point as this diagonal over here. Because if you start one over here and one over here, the symmetry is not going to happen. Remember what I said in the beginning, our brain understands verticals and horizontals more easily than diagonals and irregulars. And this is why artists use things that are called plumb lines. If you've ever heard plumb lines before, that term refers to these straight vertical lines. It's mostly straight vertical lines, but I also help myself a lot with straight horizontals. Plumb lines are used by portrait artists and lots of different artists to get alignments and symmetry and locations of different elements in when they're drawing something. Always help yourself with things like tick marks, horizontals, verticals, anything like that. And that's going to help you build up your ability to recreate those shapes, angles, proportions. I have in most of those two side planes. Now I need to close these, and I know that it's this line over here is it's not parallel to this line over here, but right now I'm just going to create parallels and I'll deal with it's not parallel there. Can you see that this is taller than this? So I'm going to bring it down. I'm just going to create parallel lines, or as parallel as I can make them freehand. Okay, so the two side planes are in. My symmetry is relatively okay. So these are two parallelograms, or diamond shapes, I guess I should say. In a bit, I will be pushing this up and changing the tapering because if you're able to tell that these are not parallel in the photo, you'd be correct. But right now, I just want to take you through the same process that I've been taking you through over and over so that this really sticks. And once I have that in, I can close this with a horizontal at the back, which I will curve in just a bit. Let me erase my extra lines. I'm going to start with a curve at the back. And I haven't added that height for that back crust. I'll do that in just a bit. For now, I just curved that back part, back edge of the top plane. I am going to create that tapered look. I'm going to make this middle vertical slightly taller. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a tapered look. The thing is, if you see the image, if you really observe closely, you're going to notice that the middle part of the pie, this section right here nearest us, is taller than the two back parts over here, creating a little bit of a tapered look. And this could be due to foreshortening because of the fact that the photo was taken very, very close to this part of the pie. The side planes are receding back away from us. And this creates a foreshortened look where these side planes are getting shorter and shorter as they're receding away from us. It could be a foreshortened situation, but it could also be due to the fact that maybe with this particular pie, the center is just taller because it's so full of apple that it's actually thicker and less tall at the back. Or it could be a combination of both things. I bet it's a combination of both things that is creating that visual effect. But what's important here is that you're able to tell these little nuances that are happening and that you start asking yourself, why could this be happening? Why is this not a parallel? Why do I see tapering over here? Because it's always going to come down to the nature of the object and to things like foreshortening that could be throwing you off. Things get distorted when there is foreshortening taking place. But anyway, I created at least a little bit of a tapered look where this height of this vertical is more than this and this. You can use your pencil as a measuring device or a ruler if you want to, so that you can make sure that the height of this middle vertical it's taller than this vertical and this vertical, so that you can have a little bit of a tapered look. So now that that's in, I'm going to continue adding crust and a little bit of detail into this without going overboard. It's up to you if you want to add the crust inside or outside, but always help yourself with the lines that you've already created. Oh, you know what? I have to create the tapered lines along the sides before adding in the crust. Otherwise, I'm going to be giving myself more work. This line is also tapered right here, and this line is also tapered. Slightly, but it's there. Now I can go ahead and create the crusts. Okay, so now I can do the parallel inside of these two to give that crust its thickness. I can also create that extra height for the crust at the back. So first I'm just going to recreate that back curve. I give it that height, creating a simple shape first. I can give the crust in the front its irregularity. Okay, so let me just add in a little bit of an indication of the crust pieces here. So let's see. Just some irregular shapes. I see that overlapping kind of weaving pattern, if you will, of the crust. I don't want you to get too distracted by details here and too focused on getting the shapes of the pie crust and things like that, because that's not the point of this exercise. We're focusing on 3D form and perspective today. And these would be more like details and textures. I just want to get in a little bit of an indication of irregularity throughout the top of the pie. And I'm just trying to get in those major shapes that I see in these areas. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. And then I'm just going to create a little bit more of irregularity over here along the back edge of the pie crust. Give it some thickness at the back and connect. A little bit of thickness over here and connect. Okay, so moving on to using my slightly softer pencil grade, going over certain lines, adding a little bit of contrast to my drawing. Another piece of apple pie, we have a lot of tapering at the front. It's the same thing as before. It just requires a little bit more visualization skill to be able to simplify the planes. The incline is so pronounced. You don't know where to create that line sometimes because there's so much of an incline and so much irregularity throughout. But I just want to encourage you, don't let that overwhelm you. Start with a triangular prism and then modify as you go. So tune out the messiness and the amount of little pieces and elements coming out of the pie. Let's do this together. If I were to simplify the back curve into a straight diagonal, probably it would be something like this, maybe a little bit less diagonal, something like that. If it's helpful for you to visualize that better, you can even create a slight light curve here so that you can start visualizing the curve at the back over that straight line, but keep everything nice and simple and flat. And then from there, I'm just gonna do my angle here and my angle here for that top plane. And I'm going to ignore the fact that things get a little bit messy over here at the front. And I'm just going to create a point here at the end, like I've been doing all along, turning this into a triangle. Clean this up a bit. I'm observing angles at this point, noticing if there's anything that I need to change, maybe make the back a little bit wider. Is the triangle too long? Is it too short? All of those things can be fixed as we go, but we need to lay down lines and shapes on our page and not be afraid to lay down lines and shapes and continue adding to our drawing so that we have more points of comparison. If we have nothing else to relate this shape or line or whatever you have to or with, then we have no point of comparison. So you need to lay down things on paper and you need to continue adding to your drawing so that you have those points of comparison. And then I'm gonna do the vertical, straight vertical over here at the back, straight vertical over here at the front, and then I'm just going to connect with a parallel. Looking at that thickness, this is my basic triangular prism. I already rounded out the back a bit, but that is essentially what I am visualizing and how I am seeing the side plane and the top plane. At this point, I'm going to start with all of the irregularity that I see there. First and foremost, there is a diagonal at the back. So I'm going to turn this into a diagonal instead of a straight vertical. I'm going to start turning this into a crust first because I can't start with all of the mess and irregularity over here until I understand what's crust and what's filling. So first I'm going to do the crust. I need that slightly tapered look, which is something that, oh, you know what? I'm going to make the slightly tapered look here at the bottom because I've already added in the thickness for this pie crust at the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this one, I'm going to bring this in kind of like that to get the front of the pie tapered. So it's that same effect that I was talking about before, but with this one, it's a lot more tapered. You can see how the back is a lot taller than the front. Over here, it's a lot taller, and then it gets smaller and smaller or shorter and shorter as it makes its way toward us. Sometimes when you're baking, the center of the pie sinks in, and this is why the back of the pie is a lot taller than the front. All I did was bring in the diagonal like so. And you can create this tapered look by doing this. So initially my bottom was parallel to this one, right? So all I did was shift it up like that so that now I have a tapered look. But you could also modify the top one and bring it down, and both would be okay because ultimately what you're trying to do is create that tapered look. But the thing is that depending on how this shape is looking and how this shape is looking in your drawing, you might find one line better to change than the other, because if you have two parallels here and if you bring this down, it's going to change the shape of your top plane, and if you bring this up, it's going to change the shape of your side plane. So just have that in mind. Sometimes I might want to change this one, sometimes I might want to change this one, but what I am ultimately trying to do is create that tapered look where this is shorter than this back part. It's kind of a case by case scenario, and you have to see and observe what is happening in your own personal drawing. Our drawings are not going to be exactly at the same point. Even though we're using the same reference, we're drawing freehand here, so it's not going to look exactly the same. I'm going to continue with all of the little irregularities and imperfections in my pie. So I have this tapered look at the back. So I'm just going to be adding the extra crust here at the top. So I'm going to add some extra height here. Extra height over here. I'm going to erase this. And I'm just going to add a little bit more detail and irregularity to make this look more like a pie. A lot of irregularity in here with the filling, and I just focus on the largest shapes that I see there. When I start getting into the detail, I like observing the medium-sized shapes and then the smallest shapes. And sometimes you'd be surprised how you don't need the teeny tiny shapes and textures for believable results, or at least to make it look more like a pie. These are all medium-sized shapes that I'm adding in very quickly and very loosely. So this one comes, I think I'm going to bring this shape down, and this one comes all the way down to the peak. So here I have another little bulgy section. And just keep working on those medium-sized shapes and details. Here, I have this apple piece that is coming out. So the crust actually ends somewhere around here, and then this is actually an apple piece that is popping out. So the crust doesn't come all the way down to the tip. This is all apple down here. Apple piece here, and then this is crust, and I'm just going to erase this extra little triangle peak there. This comes down, cleaning up with my kneaded eraser a bit. All this is apple. My crust over here, the bottom edge needs to be a little bit more irregular. This is too straight. I'm just adding some imperfection there. This is a chunk of apple. And now I'm getting into smaller shapes. Just keep drawing lightly. You don't want to get rid of your opportunity to refine things. The darker you draw, the harder it is for you to erase. And hopefully you've been seeing how I'm not grabbing my pencil like this. I'm not holding my pencil like this. I've been using more of an extended tripod. I love using the overhand grip and drawing like this when I'm using a drawing board or when I'm working on my drawing table. I think this needs to be more of an angle back here. Just angle it out a little bit more. It's all about continuing to observe and correct. Okay, I'm not gonna do too much. I want to share the cakes with you, but yeah, this is all apple in here. Make sure that you have a lot of irregularity and that you don't leave any super clean, straight lines, because that can make it, definitely make it look like a cartoon. And notice where you do see the crust, where are you able to see two planes of those crust pieces? Like the thickness of it, like little pillows, right? Sometimes giving it that little extra thickness on the side is going to make it look more like an actual voluminous little structure. When it comes to cakes, a lot of the times it's going to be a cylinder. Sometimes cakes are going to be super tall, other times they're going to be shorter, but these are all cylinders. Other times when it comes to like wedding cakes and sometimes birthday cakes, you're going to have cylinders stacked on top of each other in kind of a concentric way, where the cylinder on top is going to be smaller, right? It's the bigger cylinder, then a smaller cylinder on top, smaller cylinder on top, and so on and so forth. But these are all cylinders. So we have to get good at drawing cylinders. What happens when there's a piece cut out? Let me show you what I would do. A little trick to draw this kind of cake where there's a chunk cut out. Okay, so first of all, let's draw a cylinder. So when it comes to a cylinder, you have the top ellipse. Notice how I'm doing this technique where you go over the same shape over and over again until you kind of like it. I was not expecting myself to get a perfect ellipse right off the bat on the first try. You do get better. If you're having trouble with circles, which I do have a full video where I explain why it's so difficult to draw circles and ellipses and such, I would recommend checking it out. And I provide lots of exercises that will help you. But one of those exercises is just starting really light and drawing the same circle over and over and over again, not pressing down too hard, but the more comfortable you get with that pattern or that path, the darker you draw, okay? And that way you can strengthen the fine motor skills that you need to draw circles. Same thing when it comes to ellipses. I like starting very light and just getting a little bit darker and darker and darker as I go. How did I know how tall to make this and how wide to make this? Well, I'm observing that reference photo and I'm just trying to get that in as best as I can, but I can always refine as I go if I need to. If you're having lots of trouble with this, something that I would recommend is printing out your reference photo, whatever reference it is that you're using. Take a thick black Sharpie, trace over that top ellipse in that top plane of the cylinder. Actually trace over the edges of that top ellipse so that you can actually see how tall and how wide that ellipse is. Because sometimes, especially in the beginning when we're drawing cylinders, our tops of the cylinder is just super wide when that's not actually what is going on, or it's super tall or super wide when that's not actually what's going on. We have to get really good at observing the width versus the height of those ellipses when we're drawing cylinders, because if that's not right, the perspective of the object is not going to be right. This is very important to get right. I should say at least 90% right. I'm not saying you have to get it in perfectly, but it has to be pretty close. Once you have that ellipse in, you're going to bring down the verticals on either side, and this is a pretty tall cake. So these verticals are pretty tall. Oh, that's super lopsided. Hold on. I was drawing at a very weird perspective from my notebook. So these are pretty tall because it's a pretty tall cake. But once I have that top ellipse in and it's looking good to me, all I am doing down here is recreating this bottom curve of this ellipse, like so. If this were made of transparent plastic and you were able to see through it, or glass, something like that, you would be able to see an ellipse in here that is very similar to this ellipse. Okay, you would be able to see the ellipse through this. Let me get this right. You cannot have a very different curve down here, or a curve that is super different from this one. It has to be very similar to this one if you're trying to draw cylinders. Let me erase this line because it's not an actual transparent object. Hopefully I was able to explain myself. The bottom curve needs to be very close to the top curve. Now that you have your cylinder in, I'm going to show you how to cut a pie piece out of this so that you have something similar to what you're observing there. If I were to cut out a pie piece from this side, the first thing I want to do is understand what is the center in the middle of this top circle, or would be top circle. If we were looking at this cake directly from above it, it would be a circle. It's just that from this perspective, we're seeing an ellipse because it's more of a side view. But where would that circle be? Right in the middle of the cake. If you were seeing this cake directly from above it, like a flat lay view, it would be somewhere around there, which is usually where we go in and cut with our knife if we were to cut out a slice of cake. It wouldn't be over here. We would try to align the tip of the knife with the very center of the cake and then press down to cut out that piece, right? So where is the center of the top plane? It would be right in the middle of the circle, right in the middle of the ellipse. Once you have that visualized, all you're going to do is create a couple of lines. And I'm observing the angles present in that photo where the piece was cut out, right? So it's a triangle. And then I'm going to bring a vertical down. I'm going to erase these two curves that I no longer need because that part was cut out. And guess what I'm going to do next? I'm going to recreate this line. I'm going to make a parallel line down here. That definitely looks like a chunk of cheese, a wheel of cheese. This is the point where I would turn it into a cake because my 3D form is there, perspective is looking okay, it's looking sound, and I can now move on to turn this into a cake. So what would I do? Well, this is kind of a layered cake. I can tell it has 3 layers. The icing is very thick at the top. It's hard to see because it's chocolate on chocolate. Then I see 1 layer and then 2 layers, and then there's icing in between, kind of like that. So now it looks like a layered cake. I can add extra thickness for that icing over here along the edge. And Mono Zero Eraser would be better for this task, but there it is. Let me just erase little lines that I don't need anymore. And you can make these a little bit more irregular looking as well, so that these lines are not super stiff and straight. Even here at the bottom, you can just add a little bit of imperfection and irregularity, because the icing is not perfectly like flat. It has little curves, irregularities present. Even over here, I'm gonna change that perfect vertical at least slightly. Usually, most cakes, there is a certain amount of irregularity present. How do we approach something like this? It's the same process that I shared with you with this first one, but now we're adding in that triangular prism inside of it. Let's do this. Let's do this together. So first we have that ellipse, and try to notice the height. I know that it's hard to visualize because that large chunk has been cut out of the cake. Just try to use your intuition to come to a conclusion as to where the ellipse would end over here in the middle center bottom edge. Try to visualize how it would look if you would actually see that entire top plane, if it would be complete. And you can refine and do whatever you need to do later. If it's not looking right, you can make it wider or you can make it more narrow, whatever you need to do, but just lay something down on paper and start from there. Once you have this top ellipse, you're going to bring down the verticals on either side. This is also a pretty tall cake. My 2 verticals are in, and then I'm going to close this ellipse, or not the bottom edge, with the bottom edge of this top ellipse down here. So I'm taking essentially half of this ellipse and I'm trying to recreate it down here so that I can have that bottom edge of the cylinder. You have to make sure that the bottom edge of the cylinder is very similar to this. If the bottom edge is it's something like this, a very closed curve, and the top curve looks like this, that is not going to be, it's not going to look good. It's going to look like a bowl, not a cylinder. Now that we have this cylinder looking okay, I'm going to go ahead and add that little dot in the top center of my ellipse, or what would be a circle if we were looking down at the cake from above. From here, I'm going to recreate the 2 diagonals that I see there. Well, it's almost a horizontal and a diagonal. So I'm going to do this diagonal here and a near horizontal over here, so that I can go ahead and cut out this pie piece. I'm going to bring down this vertical. Oops, it's a little slanted. I'm going to erase this curve and this curve here. And I'm going to leave this edge right there. And what happens now with something like this is I'm going to create a parallel down here, a line that is parallel to this. Over here, I need to create a line that is parallel to this. And if you need to place a vertical right here to visualize where these 2 lines connect, you can always add that middle vertical to help you know where these 2 lines connect. Once you have this looking right, then we go ahead and start adding in the triangular prism. It's the same process that we've been doing with the pies. I understand how this can be overwhelming because now it's inside of this larger piece of cake and you're seeing 2 things at the same time. I want to encourage you to give it a go. I mean, the more times you do this, the less overwhelming it is and the more fun it is, honestly. So here's what I would do. If this is too dark, just make it a little bit lighter, because it's going to, these lines that you have back here are going to affect or distract you too much when you're drawing your triangular prism. So I just lightened that up with my kneaded eraser. And from here, I know that my last triangular prisms, I started with the top plane, and I will, but I kind of want to situate myself. Where am I going to be drawing this triangular prism inside of this larger cake section? It's kind of in there. So if this is the edge of the cake, I can see a little sliver right here of the back cake, the larger portion of the cake, before the triangular prism starts. I left that little sliver of cake showing there. And I also placed another vertical over here just to situate myself. Like, how large is this smaller cake piece in relation to this one? Also, where does it fit in that space? So by placing these two verticals, I'm just situating myself. You can do tick marks, you can do lines, whatever you'd like, but when you have two objects like this, or an object that has to fit on or inside a larger object, I would recommend just situating yourself first, understanding the location and the size of that smaller element or piece in relation to the larger one. And then once you're situated, you can go ahead and do the process that I was sharing with you with the pies. If you want to start with the top plane, then let's go ahead and get started with that. It's actually a little bit higher. It starts a little bit higher. Start with that top angle. So angle going down, and you can see all of this I'm seeing as negative area, so that I can get that slope and right. You can see this as negative shape. If that helps you get that angle right, which it definitely helps me. And then from here, what is that angle? Flatten it out. Don't be concerned with curves yet. You can curve it out later. There's the top plane of that cake piece. So I just did angle and angle. Once that's looking right, bring that vertical down, parallel to this one, parallel to this one over here. In the reference photo, I get the sense that the piece is either longer or it's a little bit pulled out a little bit more from the larger cake piece than what I have in my drawing here. So to do that, I'm just gonna make this side section a little bit longer by moving my line a little. So all I did really to make this look like I've pulled it out a little bit and have it a little bit more similar to what I'm observing there was I simply moved this line more to the right so that I could drop down this vertical past this edge and make it look like the entire piece is kind of a little bit pulled out of this larger cake section. There it is. There's the kind of base structure for the cake. And all I'm going to do now is just add a little bit of that irregularity. This is also a layered cake. I'm going to use my lines initially to like break this up into layers. Here, for example, the frosting over here at the top is super thick. So I'm just gonna kind of bring that in first, that kind of initial layer, if you will. Once that's in, all of this is frosting here at the back. I don't see the actual like spongy or cake. I just see frosting because it's so thick. And then over here, I have 3 layers again. So 1, 2, and then give them the thickness there because that's actually frosting. These are not parallel. So I need to take a little bit longer and do these correctly. I need to make sure that these 2 lines are parallel to this and this. The way that I was doing them quickly before, or the way that I had them before, the line was off. And that was throwing off my drawing and the perspective. So just be careful with that because sometimes we get anxious to finish things. Then we draw lines very quickly and our angles and our parallels are not right. So just be careful with that. And then here I have these going down kind of like that. And these are slightly, like they're not aligned. They're not perfectly aligned with these because the cake is shifted down, this slice of cake over here. So I just brought those down a bit. And then this one has the thick frosting at the top there. And this, I haven't rounded out. This needs to be rounded out and this needs to be rounded out. I still had them in a very flat straight angle or edge there. So that's pretty much it for this one. So all I'm going to do is add a little bit more of that irregularity along the edges of the cake so that the frosting is described a little bit better. A hint of that plate, which is an ellipse as well. And I want to encourage you to work on these types of sketches. Fill up sketchbook pages with quick sketches like this. These took us a while to do, but I've been trying to explain things. When you are working or doing personal practice, you have the process down. The main things to have in mind, you know them. You're going to be able to create these much faster. Take time for these quicker sketches because, as I said in the beginning of this class, the more you do these sketches, even if you leave them as simple sketches with no shading, with no color, no detail, it's going to help you build up skills so that you're able to quickly create those preliminary sketches before moving on to shading or painting. If you never make time for this type of sketching practice to build up freehand sketches from scratch, when you do want to create those preliminary sketches prior to jumping into a watercolor painting process or whatever the case may be, you're going to get very easily overwhelmed. It's going to take you forever, and you're going to want to continue depending on other artists' sketches or outline drawings before moving on to the next part of the process. And I don't want that for you. I want you to be able to build up your own original artwork from scratch. And so the only way to get there is to go through this process again and again and draw everything and anything. Remember those 3 things that I told you. They apply for everything that you're drawing. With those 3 things in mind, you are going to develop your skills to draw anything. Like, this is going to help you draw faces better, draw entire still life compositions better, draw landscapes better, because you're focusing on the right things, right? You're going through the process and it becomes second nature to you. Most food items are going to be somewhere in between a man-made object and an organic object. You can easily, at least a lot of these things, connect them with simple 3D forms like cylinders, triangular prisms, rectangular prisms, etc. Within that, there is going to be plenty of imperfection and irregularity you're going to have to work through. I hope that you've been able to see my video on the difference between man-made objects and organic objects. These are somewhere in between because there is a lot of imperfection and irregularity, but it is still very important to understand the planes so that you can think of the 3D-ness, the solidness of that structure before moving on to the details. Take this process, take this method with you, take tips that I've provided. They're going to help you tremendously as you draw anything. Have those things in mind. Draw, sketch. They don't have to be perfect. Your skills will develop as you go, I promise you, and you're going to get better and better and faster as well.